In just 5 weeks, General Sherman became Georgia's worst nightmare. Sherman's march to the sea cut a devastating swathe through the state that permanently crippled the Confederacy and brought liberation for countless slaves. The rebels had started the war, and Sherman made it his job to bring the consequences of that war to their doorstep. To do that, he reduced entire cities to flames, left families with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and left fields littered with the corpses of the young and the old. Beneath the propaganda from both sides lies the brutal truth of Sherman's march to the sea. The capture of Atlanta on September 2, 1864, was a big win for the Union. After chasing off the remaining Confederate troops in the region, Sherman had a clear shot for the 285 miles to Savannah on the coast. Sherman wrote to President Lincoln and General Grant with a proposal to launch a devastating march to the sea that would wipe out the state's economy and shatter Confederate morale. In his own words, he would make Georgia howl. As far as Sherman was concerned, the entire South was responsible for the war. Slavery was woven into every part of its society and economy, and therefore all of it was a legitimate target. "We are not only fighting hostile armies," Sherman said, "but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." The first target of the march was Atlanta itself. Sherman could not leave such a valuable city to potentially return to Confederate hands, and burning it would make for a fitting symbol of Northern dominance over the South. He ordered the total devastation of the city. Its entire railroad infrastructure was destroyed, as was every mill, factory, and warehouse that could help the enemy. 40% of the city was wiped out as fires spread out of control to consume homes and churches too. By the time Sherman left Atlanta on November 16th, he could officially report that, quote, "For military purposes, the city of Atlanta has ceased to exist." Sherman split his forces to increase the coverage of his march, and so that his men would have an easier time foraging for supplies. Sherman marched with a corps on the left flank while 2 more corps marched on the right. From the outset, they wrecked all the railways along their route. This was crippling to the Confederate war effort. The sleepers, the wooden boards in the middle of the tracks, would be torn up and piled into a bonfire. The iron railings would be thrown on top until the fire from the sleepers softened the iron so it could be bent out of shape. The rails were often bent around a tree to make what was nicknamed a Sherman necktie. But it's what Sherman's men did to the civilians of Georgia that made the march truly infamous. Union supply lines weren't yet ready to support a march into Georgia, so the army would need to feed itself with whatever it found along the way. Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 120, issued on November 9th, called for his men to forage liberally on the country. They would take as much of their food from the surrounding land as possible, leaving their own wagons of supplies as backup in an emergency. These orders were actually quite restrained. Soldiers were forbidden from entering private property or causing unwarranted destruction. An officer's approval was needed before any building was destroyed, and even this provision was restricted only to areas where, quote, "the inhabitants burn bridges, obstruct roads, or otherwise manifest local hostility." Only then, Sherman ordered, were they allowed to devastate the land. Foraging parties of several dozen men would be sent out every day to sweep the surrounding area. These soldiers came to be known as bummers. They would search for grain, meat, and other foodstuffs to feed their comrades, and they quickly found this was an easy job. Discipline was lax and danger was virtually non-existent. It was a welcome break from the discipline of military life to go wandering around the countryside taking whatever they wanted. The bummers easily gathered up more than they ever needed. Wagons came back from foraging runs overflowing with supplies. Foraging was so easy that some soldiers and officers complained that they didn't need the official supply wagons, since they only slowed the troops down, and the food they were looting was better and more plentiful anyway. With so much freedom, it was inevitable that they'd get out of control. There was no way to enforce discipline on the foraging parties, and Sherman's strict limits on the foraging were easily ignored. Soldiers took whatever they wanted from whoever they wanted. They regularly destroyed farmhouses and barns just because they could, leaving the civilian families with nothing. Soldiers would wander off from their column to pillage homes and would return laden with spoils. Sherman reported seeing soldiers with entire hams stuck on their bayonets, or jugs of honey and molasses slung under their arms. Foraging was not just a way to supply the army. It was also a total war to destroy the Confederacy's ability to resist. Anything the Union soldiers couldn't carry was destroyed. Livestock was massacred en masse. Grain stores were set ablaze and entire fields of crops were destroyed. There were also reports of them salting the fields so that they couldn't be able to grow crops for years to come. But this was most likely Confederate propaganda. The bummers were also known to execute any dogs found because they believed they might be used to chase down escaped slaves. Not all Union soldiers agreed with the actions. Many of them expressed regret and sympathy for the civilians in their letters home. One officer of the 10th Indiana Regiment lamented, "Can you imagine how those Southerners feel seeing their homes and families destroyed? Even though they started this rebellion, their wives and children don't deserve to starve." Unfortunately, the handful of Confederate troops still in Georgia would try to repay the Union for this looting, with terrible consequences for both sides. A few thousand unprepared soldiers and 3,500 rebel cavalry under Joseph Wheeler, who stood between Atlanta and Savannah, had no hope of stopping Sherman. However, that didn't mean they wouldn't waste lives trying. On November 22nd, a brigade of Sherman's men fought the first and only major infantry battle of the campaign at Griswoldville, about 10 miles east of Macon. Confederate troops approached the town shortly after the Union arrived and threw themselves at the Union's defenses. It was hopelessly one-sided. One after another, their lines crumbled to pieces. One Union veteran recalled, "It was awful the way we slaughtered those men." The surviving Confederate soldiers retreated after a few hours. The Union had lost just 13 men dead and 79 wounded, while the Confederacy saw several hundred dead, wounded, or captured. But as the Union soldiers went out to inspect the aftermath of the battle, any sense of victory was hollowed out. Old gray-haired and weakly-looking men and little boys, not over 15 years old, lay dead or writhing in pain, wrote one Union soldier. An estimated 80% of the South's fighting-age men had already been called up. Most of the people left to defend against Sherman's march were old, sick, and children. With the Union marching deep into their homeland, the Confederacy scraped the bottom of the barrel for anyone capable of holding a gun to resist him and sent them into Union firing lines. The results were entirely predictable. The Union's spirit for their enemy was not infinite, though, as they would soon learn. On November 23rd, Union soldiers captured the city of Milledgeville and spent Thanksgiving in the city. However, when Union soldiers arrived after being rescued from Confederate prisons, the mood shifted. The prisoners returned half-starved and on the brink of death. Many had been beaten and tortured. The holiday spirit was ruined and replaced with a cry for vengeance. Sherman issued orders to expand the destruction to include every mill, factory, and plantation in their path. The cruelty from both sides was about to get worse. As Sherman's bummers swept through Georgia, reports of wanton destruction, abuse, rape, and murder filled the Confederate press. Determining what was true and what was exaggerated or invented for propaganda purposes can be difficult. Modern studies found that rates of venereal diseases, a telltale sign of sexual crimes during wartime, were actually much lower among Sherman's men than the average soldier. Nevertheless, reports of such atrocities spread like wildfire among the soldiers. For example, several of Wheeler's men reported finding a tied-up woman screaming and crying out to be rescued. The woman claimed that 7 Union soldiers had tied her up and forced her to watch them violate, then murder her daughter right in front of her. Supposedly, the perpetrators were caught and executed later that day. Reports of these atrocities by Sherman's bummers led the Confederacy to declare a non-tolerance policy for captured foragers. All captured bummers would be killed on sight. Wheeler's cavalry focused on harassing the forage parties since any attack on the main columns would be a death sentence. Wheeler's men showed a particular fondness for slitting the throats of captured bummers rather than simply shooting them. The Union knew that falling into Wheeler's hands meant death. One Union major who was able to stop his men bumming a village near Atlanta admitted as such. "If we were to continue our devastation as we began today, I don't want to be captured on this trip, for I expect every man of us will get a stout rope and a short shrift." Sherman and Wheeler fell into a vicious cycle of brutal retaliation for crimes that weren't even verifiable. For example, after the Battle of Griswoldville, Union soldiers reported that 18 men were executed by Wheeler's cavalry, many of them with their throats slashed. Their commanding officer, Brigadier General Hugh Kilpatrick, wrote to Sherman asking for permission to do the same to captured Confederates. Aware that these stories of atrocities could often be false, Sherman urged Kilpatrick to verify the story first. If he did so, then Sherman told him, "You may hang and mutilate man for man without regard for rank." Sherman's treatment of Confederate prisoners was harsh. While Confederate troops were not a major problem for his march, mines were. His men took numerous casualties from minefields as they advanced, and Sherman had a cruel solution. If mines are found, you may cause them to be put on the ground and tested by a wagon load of prisoners, or if needs be, a citizen implicated in their use. Essentially, his orders were to send prisoners and civilians into minefields to clear them for his troops. In one instance towards the end of the campaign, Sherman came across one of his men whose horse had been killed by a mine. The young officer's leg had also been blown off. The sight of it enraged Sherman, who considered the mines to be a cowardly and deceitful weapon. He immediately called up a band of Confederate prisoners, men who had nothing to do with the mines that had injured his men, and ordered them to march ahead of his troops to set off mines. The terrified men begged for mercy, but Sherman admitted, "I reiterated the order and could hardly help laughing at their stepping so gingerly along the road." This cruelty to the enemy might be expected, but that didn't mean there wasn't also cruelty to the very people the Union was supposed to be liberating. Slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War, and it was a powerful motivator for the men who fought in it. However, it would be wrong to pretend that many of the Union men didn't harbor racist attitudes of their own. Just because they opposed slavery, that didn't mean they saw black people as equals. As Union foragers looted and burned across Georgia, there were plenty of reports of slaves being victimized as well. During the destruction of plantations, it wasn't uncommon for Union soldiers to burn slave quarters or slave homes as well. That left those newly free people with nowhere to go. The Union expected to have a deal with freed slaves, but Sherman was concerned at how many of these slaves would try to follow the army. He was happy to integrate able-bodied men into support battalions, but he urged that most freed slaves stay where they were. It was hard enough to feed the soldiers without thousands of freed slaves trailing them. Of course, Union looting often made that impossible. As the Union advanced through Georgia, they accumulated thousands of freed slave followers. These men and women were rightly afraid that their masters or Confederate troops would return after the Union boys left. They had no property or land of their own, and what land was available had been burned and looted by the Union anyway. What did they have to lose by following the army? As it turned out, everything. On December 8th, Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davies, not to be confused with the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, reached Ebenezer Creek 20 miles north of Savannah with 14,000 men and a following of 600 recently liberated slaves. Wheeler's Confederate scouts had been shadowing him for several miles up to the creek. Davies ordered his men to work through the night to build a bridge so they could cross before Wheeler made his move. As soon as the bridge was finished early the next morning, Davies ordered his men across first, but as the 600 freed men went to follow, he ordered the bridge destroyed behind him. All 600 of them were left stranded on the far side of the river as Confederate cavalry approached. Desperation took over, and many of them tried swimming across. Some were lucky enough to reach the other side. Many others drowned in the swampy waters. The rest were quickly recaptured or killed by the Confederate troops. The Ebenezer Creek massacre triggered a wave of outrage. Even Davies' own troops were angry with him. How could the Union claim to be fighting to free slaves when they would happily abandon them by the hundreds? Sherman was inundated with complaints from soldiers, officers, journalists, and religious leaders to respond to the tragedy and make sure it never happened again. Sherman refused to relieve Davies of his command, and the Union had too few experienced commanders for him to dismiss one. But it did lead him to issue Special Field Order No. 15 to redistribute portions of captured land to freed slaves a few months later. When the Union Army reached the defenses near Savannah on December 10th, they found 10,000 Confederate troops waiting for them. Far too small a force to seriously consider holding the city against Sherman for long, Confederate troops abandoned the city without a fight on December 20th. Sherman's march to the sea had been a total success. For many Confederates, it was a fatal blow to their belief that the South could win, and paved the way for the surrender the following year. Most Union soldiers considered the march to be one of the best periods of the war. Most of them never saw a fight during it, and enjoyed good food and free rein to take revenge on a hated enemy. 136 men were killed, and almost 700 injured among Sherman's forces between November 15th and December 10th. But that month's worth of casualties was lower than the average daily casualties in the Civil War overall. Relatively speaking, the march to the sea was a breeze for the soldiers. Sherman reported over 300 miles of railway destroyed, and a total of $100 million in damage, over $1 billion in today's money. The human cost is harder to say. The Union Army did not keep close records of the civilians it killed, and the Confederacy was in no position to do it either. After the war, the victorious Union had no interest in investigating anything that made their men look bad. There was no significant action to punish any of Sherman's men for crimes committed during the march. But Georgia itself was punished. The state suffered waves of famines in the years after the Civil War that inflicted terrible suffering on both the white and black populations. A significant reason for those famines was the devastation Sherman's men unleashed upon the land and the people on it. Calls for charity to alleviate their suffering went mostly unheard in the victorious North, who had little sympathy for the defeated people. Today, Sherman's march is remembered as a tremendous victory for the Union, and a tremendous evil by many Southerners. Certainly, it brought plenty of destruction and death, However, for the sake of ending the war and liberating enslaved peoples, Sherman believed it was an acceptable sacrifice. 160 years later, there are still those who would disagree with him.